Cindy, 37-year-old woman, had always been the rock of her family, the kind of woman who could hold everything together, even in the worst of storms. 10 years ago, that storm had been the sudden death of her husband, John. John died in a violent car accident. On the highway, a milk tanker crashed into him at high speed. Death came instantly, and Sydney could not do anything to help. God, what a loss it was for her, because John was the love of her life. They had been high school sweethearts, the kind of couple that everyone envied for their unbreakable bond and unwavering love. John's death had left a gaping hole in her heart, one that she feared would never heal. In the aftermath of his passing, Cindy found herself alone with their young daughter, Dorothy. Dorothy was just 10 at the time, old enough to understand loss, but too young to grasp the permanence of it. Cindy remembered the nights she would sit by Dorothy's bed, reading her stories until she fell asleep, only to stay up late into the night herself, crying quietly so as not to wake her daughter. Financially, things were tight. John had been the primary breadwinner, and his death had left them in a precarious position. Cindy took on whatever jobs she could find to make ends meet. She worked as a cashier at the local grocery store during the day and cleaned offices at night. Despite the exhaustion, she never missed Dorothy's school events. She was determined to provide her daughter with as much stability and normalcy as possible. As the years went by, Cindy and Dorothy developed a routine. Dorothy grew into a bright, beautiful young woman with her mother's resilience and her father's big, kind eyes and lips. They had a small house, nothing fancy, but it was filled with love and memories. Cindy made sure of that. Every Sunday, they would bake cookies together, a tradition that started when Dorothy was little. It was their time to bond, to laugh, and to momentarily forget the hardships they faced. Remember this moment with the cookies. One day it will become key in our story. But as Dorothy grew older, Cindy started to feel the pangs of loneliness more acutely. She had devoted so much of her life to being a mother and provider that she had forgotten what it felt like to be a woman with dreams and desires of her own. For almost 10 years, Cindy kept her love for John and could not even look at other men. And in the end, she was focused on raising her daughter. But time took its toll. As we know, it heals any wounds. It was on a crisp autumn day that Cindy met Richard. She was at the local farmer's market, one of the few luxuries she allowed herself. Dorothy was away at college, and Cindy had a rare weekend to herself. She was inspecting a basket of apples when she felt someone watching her. "Those are the best apples you'll find here," he said, pointing to the basket she was holding. "They're my favorite." Cindy smiled politely, feeling a bit flustered. "Thank you. I'll take your word for it." The man extended his hand. "I'm Richard." "Cindy," she replied, shaking his hand. They talked for a while, and Cindy found herself laughing more than she had in years. Richard was charming, intelligent, and genuinely interested in what she had to say. He was a breath of fresh air, a reminder that life could still hold surprises and joys, even after all the pain. As the conversation flowed, Richard suggested they take a walk in the nearby park. Cindy hesitated for a moment, but found herself agreeing. There was something about Richard that made her feel comfortable, even in the damp, chilly weather of fall. They strolled through the park, their breath visible in the cold air, the leaves crunching underfoot. The path to the park's lake was particularly slippery that day, covered in wet leaves and mud. As they walked down a gentle slope towards the water, Cindy's foot slipped, and she felt herself losing balance. In a split second, Richard's strong hands were around her waist, steadying her. "Whoa, careful there," he said, his voice filled with concern. Cindy looked up at him, her heart pounding not just from the scare, but from the closeness of the moment. His eyes were sincere, his smile reassuring. In that instant, something shifted inside her. It was as if she had been struck by lightning, a sudden and undeniable realization that she was falling for this man. Richard helped her back onto the path, his hand lingering on her arm as if to make sure she was truly all right. Cindy felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Thank you," she said, her voice slightly shaky. "No problem at all," Richard replied, his smile never faltering. "I'm glad I was here to catch you." Cindy returned home that night, her cheeks flushed from the cool autumn air and the excitement bubbling inside her. As she stepped through the door, Dorothy, who was home for the weekend from college, immediately noticed the change in her mother. Dorothy had been engrossed in her textbooks, but the sight of her mother beaming drew her attention instantly. Dorothy couldn't help but notice the difference in her mother. Cindy, usually composed and reserved, was radiating joy. Her eyes sparkled, and there was a lightness in her step. Dorothy, filled with curiosity, put her books aside and approached her mother with a look of eager anticipation. Cindy tried to contain her joy, but the smile on her face was uncontainable. Dorothy's eyes sparkled with intrigue as she waited for her mother to explain the source of her happiness. Cindy, feeling the warmth in her daughter's gaze and the urge to share her newfound joy, motioned for Dorothy to join her on the couch. They sat down, the living room lit softly by the lamps, creating a cozy and intimate atmosphere perfect for their heart-to-heart. Taking a deep breath, Cindy began to recount her evening. She described meeting Richard at the farmer's market, their impromptu walk in the park, and the way he had caught her when she slipped near the lake. She spoke of his charm, his kindness, and how he made her laugh. Cindy's words flowed with a sense of wonder and excitement, her hands gesturing animatedly as she shared each detail. She told how they met in a store buying apples, then walked in the park, and how he caught her in the autumn slush. Dorothy listened intently, her heart swelling with happiness for her mother. She could see the transformation in Cindy, the way Richard had brought back a spark that had long been extinguished. Dorothy was thrilled to see her mother so alive and vibrant, and she couldn't wait to learn more about this man who had captured Cindy's heart. Dorothy's mind raced with questions about Richard, eager to know everything about the man who had brought such joy into her mother's life. Cindy, seeing the genuine happiness and curiosity in her daughter's eyes, felt a sense of relief and gratitude. She had been hesitant to share this new chapter of her life, but now, sitting there with Dorothy, she knew it was the right decision. The evening turned into a cherished memory for both of them, a moment of bonding and mutual understanding. Cindy's heart was full, not just from her budding romance with Richard, but also from the support and love she felt from her daughter. In that moment, Cindy realized that she was not only rediscovering love, but also strengthening the bond she shared with Dorothy. Over the next few weeks, Cindy and Richard's relationship blossomed. They met for coffee, went on long walks, and even attended a local art exhibit together. Each meeting was filled with laughter and deep conversations, and Cindy felt herself opening up in ways she hadn't thought possible. Richard was everything she could have hoped for. He was attentive, kind, and genuinely interested in her life. He listened to her stories about John and Dorothy, and he shared his own experiences, his hopes, and his dreams. Cindy found herself looking forward to their dates, her heart racing every time she saw his name on her phone. And now, my dear listeners, I ask you to be as attentive as possible. We are falling into a very dark pool. Dorothy noticed the change in her mother. Cindy seemed happier, more vibrant. When Dorothy came home for the holidays, she met Richard for the first time. He was charming and polite, and Dorothy could see why her mother was so taken with him. She was happy for Cindy, even though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just her protectiveness, the lingering impact of losing her father so young. But she pushed those thoughts aside, wanting to support her mother's newfound happiness. Dorothy was a very sensitive and insightful person. She literally saw right through people, and this case was no exception. As their relationship deepened, Richard began to spend more time at Cindy's house. He was there for family dinners, helping with household chores, and even fixing things around the house. Cindy felt like she was living in a dream. For the first time in years, she felt loved and cherished. But dreams can be deceiving. Richard had a darker side, one that he kept well hidden. Cindy started to notice small things at first: a quick temper, a controlling nature. He would get upset if she made plans without him or if she talked to other men, even casually. He would apologize afterward, of course, blaming stress or fatigue, and Cindy, wanting to believe in the man she had fallen in love with, would forgive him. Richard and Cindy's relationship continued to flourish, much to Dorothy's delight. Richard, at first, was incredibly polite and respectful whenever Dorothy was around. He focused almost exclusively on Cindy, engaging her in conversation and showing genuine interest in her life. Richard's presence seemed to bring a new energy into their home, and Dorothy was happy to see her mother so content. Initially, Richard's behavior towards Dorothy was almost distant. He treated her like any other guest might treat their host's child, with polite disinterest. He would greet her warmly but briefly, always ensuring that his attention remained on Cindy. This made Dorothy feel comfortable, as Richard's focus on her mother seemed to confirm that his intentions were sincere and his affection genuine. However, as weeks turned into months, Dorothy began to notice subtle changes in Richard's behavior. It started with small, almost imperceptible gestures. During their family dinners, Dorothy caught Richard's gaze lingering on her a bit too long. When they exchanged pleasantries, his eyes seemed to hold a certain intensity that made her uneasy. At first, Dorothy dismissed these observations as paranoia. After all, Richard had been nothing but respectful to her mother and her. She didn't want to spoil a happiness that had returned to their household. But the uncomfortable feeling persisted and grew stronger with time. Richard's interactions with Dorothy became more frequent and intrusive. What used to be a polite nod or a casual greeting evolved into more prolonged and intimate touches. He would place his hand on her shoulder and leave it there a second too long, or his fingers would brush against hers when passing her a dish at the dinner table. These seemingly innocent touches began to feel calculated and deliberate, especially for Dorothy, who was a very anxious and empathic person. At first, Dorothy dismissed these observations as paranoia. After all, Richard had been nothing but respectful to her mother and her. She didn't want to spoil a happiness that had returned to their household. But the uncomfortable feeling persisted and grew stronger with time. Richard's interactions with Dorothy became more frequent and intrusive. What used to be a polite nod or a casual greeting evolved into more prolonged and intimate touches. He would place his hand on her shoulder and leave it there a second too long, or his fingers would brush against hers when passing her a dish at the dinner table. These seemingly innocent touches began to feel calculated and deliberate. Dorothy's discomfort grew with each passing day. She tried to avoid being alone with Richard, but it became increasingly difficult as he found more reasons to be around her. When her mother was in another room, Richard would strike up conversations with Dorothy, asking her about her college life and personal interests. His tone was friendly, but there was an underlying intensity that made Dorothy's skin crawl. Cindy, blissfully unaware of these subtle shifts, continued to revel in her relationship with Richard. She was happier than she had been in years, and Richard's charm and attentiveness made her feel cherished and loved. Dorothy didn't want to ruin this happiness, but the growing sense of unease was becoming too hard to ignore. One evening, Richard offered to help Dorothy with her homework. It was a simple gesture, but Dorothy felt a knot form in her stomach. She reluctantly agreed, hoping that her discomfort was all in her head. They sat at the dining table, Richard's presence close and overwhelming. As they worked through the problems, his hand would occasionally rest on her back, sending shivers down her spine. At that moment, Cindy came into the room, calling Richard, and he just as voluptuously left as if nothing had happened. Dorothy kept trying to tell herself that this was just the behavior of a polite person. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong yet. Remember my reminder to you that you need to remember the day the girls make cookies. Now be careful. As the sun began to set on that fateful day, casting its warm golden rays over the bustling city, Cindy prepared for the event that she had been looking forward to for weeks. It was a gathering of friends and family, a celebration of life and love, and she had invited Richard to join them, believing that he would be the perfect addition to their little family. As the day wore on, Cindy noticed that they were running low on flour, a crucial ingredient for the cookies that she had planned to bake for the event. With a smile on her face and a promise to return as quickly as possible, she left the apartment, leaving Dorothy and Richard alone together. Dorothy, a vision of beauty and grace, had taken extra care with her appearance that day. Her long brown hair was styled in an elegant updo, and her dress, a stunning shade of emerald green, hugged her curves in all the right places. As soon as Cindy was gone, Richard's demeanor changed, his eyes darkening with a hunger that made Dorothy's skin crawl. He began to comment on how much she resembled her mother, his voice low and seductive, and she could feel his eyes roaming over her body, taking in every curve and contour. With a trembling hand, Dorothy tried to excuse herself, claiming that she needed to use the bathroom. But as she turned to leave, Richard's fingers reached out, brushing against her hair and sending shivers down her spine. She hurried away, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with thoughts of how to escape the situation that she found herself in. Dorothy tried to excuse herself, determined to keep herself occupied and avoid any further contact with Richard. She decided to continue baking the cookies, her hands moving quickly and efficiently as she mixed the ingredients together. But her efforts were in vain, for Richard was not content to leave her alone. He approached her from behind, his hands reaching out to touch her, his breath hot against her ear as he whispered words of desire and longing. He lifted the hem of her dress, his fingers brushing against her skin, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to push him away. But Richard was relentless, his grip tightening as he pulled her close, his voice a low growl as he told her how much she resembled her mother, how intoxicating her scent was. Dorothy could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, her body shaking with fear and revulsion as she struggled to break free from his grasp. Dorothy's voice was filled with fear and desperation as she screamed at Richard, demanding answers and pleading with him to stop. But her words fell on deaf ears, for Richard was consumed by his own twisted desires, his hands roaming over her body as he sought to possess her completely. Cindy, still unaware of the horrors unfolding within her home, remained absent, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls as she searched for the missing items on her shopping list. Meanwhile, back in the apartment, Richard continued his assault, his fingers inching closer and closer to Dorothy's most intimate places. As the situation grew increasingly dire, Dorothy's mind raced with thoughts of escape, her eyes darting around the room in search of a weapon or a means of defense. And then her gaze fell upon the gleaming blade of a kitchen knife, its sharp edge glinting in the fading light of the day. With a surge of determination, she lunged for the weapon, her fingers closing around the cold metal hilt. But Richard was too quick, his hand slamming down onto hers with brutal force, his grip tightening like a vice as he continued his vile work. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thick and heavy, the silence punctuated only by Dorothy's muffled cries and the sound of Richard's ragged breaths. And then, just as it seemed that all hope was lost, the shrill sound of the doorbell cut through the oppressive atmosphere, ringing out like a clarion call to arms. But Richard remained undeterred, his hands still locked around Dorothy's body as he continued to ignore the increasingly insistent calls from outside. The bell rang again and again, each peal a desperate plea for help, but still he did not relent. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the ringing stopped, the silence once more descending upon the room like a shroud. Richard's hands moved to cover Dorothy's mouth, his fingers pressing down with cruel force as he sought to silence her cries. But in that moment, as she lay there, her body bruised and battered, her spirit broken and crushed, Dorothy heard a sound that filled her with a glimmer of hope. It was the sound of her mother's voice, shrill and terrified, echoing through the halls as she raced towards them, her footsteps pounding like the beat of a war drum. With a burst of energy born of desperation and fear, Dorothy struggled against Richard's grip, her body writhing and twisting as she fought to break free. And then, just as it seemed that all was lost, her mother burst into the room, her eyes wide with horror, and her hands reaching out to pull her daughter from the clutches of the monster that had invaded their lives. As the nightmare unfolded before her eyes, Cindy found her strength and began to fight back with all her might. Her hands flew at Richard's face, her fists connecting with his ears and head as she screamed at him to stop, her voice filled with rage and despair. But Richard was not so easily deterred, his hands tightening around Cindy's throat as he sought to silence her cries. He roared at her, his voice a twisted mockery of love, demanding to know why she had interfered, why she had ruined their chance at happiness. Dorothy, her mind reeling from the horrors that she had witnessed, found herself reaching for the knife that still lay on the floor, its blade stained with the blood of her attacker. With a cry of fear and desperation, she plunged the weapon into Richard's side, the blade slicing through flesh and muscle with a sickening sound. Again and again, she struck, her movements fueled by a primal need for survival, her eyes wide with terror as she watched the life drain from Richard's body. And then, as the knife became lodged in his flesh, she fell to the ground, her body shaking with sobs as she clutched at the wound in her chest. Richard, his strength fading with each passing moment, tried one last time to attack Dorothy, his fingers grasping for her hair as he sought to drag her down with him. But his grip was weak, his body racked with pain, and he fell to the ground beside her, his life slipping away as the blood flowed from his mouth. Cindy, her own wounds forgotten in the face of her daughter's pain, gathered Dorothy in her arms, her voice soft and soothing as she whispered words of comfort and reassurance. And then, with a strength born of a mother's love, she reached for the phone and dialed the emergency number, her fingers trembling as she waited for the help that they so desperately needed. When the police and ambulance finally arrived, they found Cindy and Dorothy huddled together on the floor, their arms wrapped tightly around one another as they wept for all that they had lost. It took several minutes for the officers and medical personnel to calm the terrified women, their voices soft and soothing as they tried to coax them away from the scene of the crime and into the safety of their care. As they were led away, Cindy whispered urgently in her daughter's ear, begging her to place the blame for Richard's death on her shoulders, to say that it was she who had struck the fatal blow. But Dorothy, her mind still reeling from the horrors that she had witnessed, could not bring herself to lie, her voice trembling as she recounted the events of that terrible day, her heart heavy with the weight of all that had been lost. At the police station, the two women were questioned separately, their statements recorded and scrutinized in an effort to piece together the truth of what had transpired. And though the process was long and arduous, they both remained steadfast, their love for one another providing a beacon of light in the darkness that threatened to consume them. In the weeks and months that followed, Cindy and Dorothy would face a multitude of challenges as they sought to rebuild their lives in the wake of tragedy. They would attend therapy sessions, their hearts and minds slowly healing as they worked through the trauma of their shared ordeal. And they would lean on one another, their bond stronger than ever, as they faced the world with courage and with hope. After a lengthy trial, the court carefully considered the testimony of both Cindy and Dorothy, weighing the evidence presented and the harrowing details of the events that had led to Richard's death. And in the end, they reached a conclusion that would forever change the lives of the two women. It was revealed that Richard had, in fact, been diagnosed with a host of mental illnesses, including psychopathy, sociopathy, and borderline personality disorder. These conditions, the court determined, had contributed to his twisted and abusive behavior, his charm and charisma masking the darkness that lay within. Taking these factors into account, the court ruled that the actions of Cindy and Dorothy had been taken in self-defense, their desperate attempts to protect themselves and one another from a man who had sought to destroy them. And while it was acknowledged that Dorothy had perhaps gone too far in her efforts to save her mother, the responsibility for Richard's death was ultimately shared between the two women. As a result, both Cindy and Dorothy were given a sentence of 6 months probation, their actions deemed a necessary response to the threat that Richard had posed. In addition, they were both prescribed a year of therapy with a qualified psychotherapist, their mental and emotional well-being deemed a priority in the wake of their ordeal. And so, with the verdict handed down and their fates sealed, Cindy and Dorothy began the long and difficult process of healing. They attended their therapy sessions, their hearts and minds slowly mending as they worked through the trauma of their shared experience. And they continued to lean on one another, their bond stronger than ever, as they faced the world with courage and with hope. For theirs was a story of love and loss, of betrayal and redemption, and of the indomitable spirit that lies within the heart of every human being. And though the shadows of their past would always linger, they would face them with courage and with hope, knowing that the light of love would always burn brighter than the darkness that sought to consume them.